Okay, can you all see the slides? I hope you can. Um, my name is Danny Dorling. I'm Professor of Geography here at Oxford. I've been interested in economic inequality for a long time, and I'm particularly interested in differences between countries because I'm a geographer, and I think differences between countries reveal a great deal. The reasons I'm interested in inequality are the very strong associations between inequality and social harms. And that's why it is interesting if we are beginning to see a fall in inequality in parts of the world and in many countries in the world. And it's very early days to say whether this is happening, but if it is happening, it matters. You probably know, but the extent of social harms associated with high economic inequality are very wide and growing. They range from children in affluent countries which are very unequal, doing far worse on average at school than children who grow up in more equitable countries. So scores at problem solving or at literacy, or especially at maths, are worse in more unequal countries. And this can result in, for instance, people who go to university in the United Kingdom, which is very unequal, or the United States, which is very unequal, actually being worse at mathematics than people who go to university in other countries. But there are many, many other harms that are associated with inequality. People consume more in more unequal countries, they pollute more. The carbon footprint is twice as much per person in the United States as compared to Japan. People are more likely to fly. People are less likely to arrange better transport systems, such as train systems, in more unequal countries. And you have much greater poverty, of course, in more unequal countries, and probably more waste by the affluent. So there are many, many reasons to worry about inequality. But the interesting thing is whether inequality has been falling. I'm going to show you a series of graphs. These come from the World Income Database, the latest data, particularly about the best of 1% by income. Everything I'm going to look at concerns income and not wealth, because we can measure income more easily, and because changes in income tend to occur before changes in wealth. So if we are going to see the world becoming more equal, it'll first happen with falls in income inequalities, and later on, with a lag maybe of 2 decades, we will see wealth inequalities fall. We saw this the other way around. When income inequalities began to rise, inequalities in wealth didn't begin to rise for about 2 decades afterwards. So income inequalities are particularly interesting to tell you what is happening in the short term. The second set of data I want to look at is data from the United Nations Development Programme, which I looked at about 10 years ago, and only in the last few weeks have I managed to look at the most recent data. There was a gap when they didn't collect the data, and I think the results from this are very interesting. But before I show you any of that, I want to show you a slide that is very well known about the world as a whole. This slide comes from the work of Branko Milanovic. This particular version of the elephant graph was published in 2014 in the Atlantic magazine. And what's interesting is more recent versions, even though they have the same dates on, the change here is from 1988 to 2008, I think are using slightly more up-to-date data, and so I'll show you a more recent version of this graph. But just to go through what the graph shows, it's looking at the entire global income distribution from the very poorest 5% of people. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but I'm wiggling over the poorest 5%, through to the best off 1% in the world. And over this period, the poorest 5%, who had almost no income, saw almost no growth in their income. So this was people who were locked out of growth entirely. But as soon as you got up to the best off, well, not the best off, the second worst off quintile and the middle quintile, you're seeing rises in incomes, mainly in China, of about 70% in this period. Huge increases in average incomes. And these people are in the middle of the global income distribution, and so for most people there has been an improvement, and those people are not the richest. And then you go down the elephant and you get down to the bottom, and an actual fall in people who are 3/4 of the way along the world income distribution. Some of the best off people in the world, the kind of people who work in this university, are all in this group. And they haven't seen a real increase in their income since 1988. So university lecturers in Britain are currently on strike and are working to rule because the employers have offered them only a 1% pay rise, and they've had a real terms fall in their income of about 14% over the last 10 years. But then, as you get up to the trunk and the very best off 1% in the world, you again see a rise of about 60% in income. So that's a complicated global picture. But if you ignore the very poorest 5% and you ignore the very richest 1%, you're looking at an equalization in world income in our lifetimes. Now, interestingly, Branko doesn't use Gini coefficients very much. I don't like Gini coefficients. I don't like abstract summaries of inequality. I think it helps to look at the overall distribution. It helps to look at the income share of the 1% because the 1% takes such a large proportion of income. If the 1% take less, that forces everybody else who is very well off to take less. They can't take more, otherwise they would be in the 1%. And so the 1% is a very useful summary measure of income inequality. But I'm also interested in ratios. How much does the average person in the best off tenth of society and the average household in the best off tenth of society get compared to the average household in the poorest tenth of society? But you've got to be very careful here. You mustn't compare medians, you need to compare means, otherwise you get a very distorted view. So what Milanovic has shown is that between 1988 and 2008, people in the second poorest and the middle quintile of the global income distribution saw their incomes rise between 20 and 75% in real terms. And these were the greatest rises in the world. And so you need to look at that context. Now, here's the most recent version of the graph, published in May 2016. I've put a web address up there if you want to know where it comes from. And if you can see my mouse, you'll see that the bottom 5 percentile points of the global income distribution, rather than having had no improvement over this period, have actually had a small 15% improvement. Now that's 15% increase in real terms on a tiny income as it is, but it's different. The rest of the curve is similar, but slightly differently shaped. And when you get to point B, you'll see that rather than having a small fall, by the revised data here, people, again, who work in universities in rich countries have actually seen a static position, and then the very best off, not quite as big as before, just under 7%. But again, it's the elephant-shaped global curve. And that is the curve where we ignore national boundaries. We're looking at everybody in the world and treating them relatively equally. But what happens if we begin to look at countries? Now, this data is from the United Nations Development Programme. It is data which was published for several years up until 2005, and which we used to produce a series of maps in the global mapping series called World Mapper. Those data were discontinued shortly after 2005, so it wasn't possible to know what was happening until recently. And recently the data series has appeared again in the World Development Report of UNDP. So I'll try and explain what this data is, because it's important to know what you're looking at before we get excited about the change. Here you're seeing only countries in the rich world. The rich world as defined by UNDP, the most affluent countries by their own Human Development Index. And you're only seeing the 10 most equitable countries. The first column of data is showing the income ratio between the mean for the best off fifth of households to the worst off fifth of households. So in Slovenia, in recent years, the best off fifth of households have enjoyed an income that is only 3.6 times more than the worst off fifth of households, on average with the arithmetic mean average. Now, by this point, you've lost almost everybody. I may well have lost you, but the problem is if I've lost you and you're interested in inequality and you know about economics and numbers, we really do have a problem. But this is a measure of inequality. 3.6, the difference between what the best off fifth of society in Slovenia have and the worst off fifth by household, because this data comes from household surveys. Now, if you looked about 10 years or more earlier, the figure the UNDP were reporting then was 3.9. Slovenia has had a fall of 0.3 in the inequality ratio in recent decades. It's become more equal. And it's not just Slovenia. Sweden, very equitable country, now has a ratio of 3.7. It had a ratio that we celebrated before, if you thought that great equality was good, of 4. Not that equal. The best off fifth of society, enjoying every day 4 times the income of the worst off fifth. But that, again, has fallen. Sweden has become more equal. The Czech Republic has become slightly more unequal. Denmark has become slightly more equal. Denmark is moving to greater and greater income equality, but wealth equality's got some way to go. And then the tiniest rises in Norway, Finland, and Slovenia, 0.1, 0.2, 0.1, essentially stable and very equal countries. But then falls. The Netherlands, you're looking at a fall in inequality, so things getting better in the Netherlands, to a ratio of 4.5, big fall from 5.5. Smaller fall in Hungary, remarkably, despite all the anger in Hungary at the moment, and a smaller fall in Austria. So amongst those most equal 10 countries in the rich world, 5 of them are actually becoming more equal. But let's look at the rest of the table. So these are all the other countries for which we have data at both points in time from UNDP who are rich countries. Germany, there's been an increase in inequality in Germany. This is well known in Germany. It is not huge, but Germany is still the 11th most equitable country out of that group. We've already looked at the top 10. Belgium's had an increase, again not huge, and it's still fairly equitable. But then there have been decreases. France has had a decrease in inequality, slightly bigger than the increase in Germany. Poland has had a decrease. Now, how has that come about? What has occurred? Is it reparations coming back to families? Is that included in the household income surveys which are used? Is this money coming back from Germany and the UK from people who've moved there from Poland who are sending it back? Is it that the price of labour in Poland is worth more? We don't know. Then the next country down, Switzerland, also pretty equitable. The gap is just 5.2 between the best off fifth and the worst off fifth. Switzerland has become more equal in recent years, and Ireland by this data. Croatia, slightly more unequal. Japan, quite a lot more unequal. And this has been causing a lot of interest in Japan. Japanese scholars write about growing inequality and write about how terrible it is, but perhaps not with much idea that their ratio of 5.4 is still pretty good compared to other affluent countries, and may be influenced by changing demographic structure. So there are more and more single elderly people in Japan. If you're looking at household inequality, that can change simply by your demographic structure changing. I'll go more quickly now, but you can see I find these numbers very interesting. Falls, oops, I went too quickly then. Falls in Estonia, rises in Lithuania, Canada is static, big falls in Australia, Greece, slight increase, Italy, slight increase, Latvia, slight increase, Spain, a bigger increase, the United Kingdom, a small increase, but look at just how unequal we are. 7.6 times more enjoyed by people like me in the best of people society, compared to the person who will come in about an hour's time to clean this room, who will be getting 7.6 times less per hour than I get. And then we have the United States, 9.8, massive inequality. The best of fifth getting 9.8 times more than the worst of fifth United States, and a rise of 1.4 in that ratio since around about 2005. And then Israel, with an even bigger rise in Israel when you include everybody in Israel to get to 10.3. So the United Kingdom, the United States, and Israel stand out like sore thumbs. Spain is just below them because of austerity and what happened in Spain with the economic crash. But we are talking to each other in very unequal countries compared to most rich countries, which are also unusual in that they're becoming more unequal, whereas many of the richest countries are already very equal compared to the rest of the world and becoming more equal, which is a story you don't often hear. Finally, in this table, Argentina and Chile are included in the most developed countries now by UNDP, and just look at the huge falls in inequality that occurred in those two countries, minus 7.5, minus 6.1. But they're still more unequal than Israel and the United States. But they won't be for much longer. If they carry on at all along this current path, then soon you'll see Israel, the United States, and the United Kingdom as being the most equitable countries in the rich world, even if you include countries like Argentina and Chile. And Latin America traditionally has been the most economically unequal continent. Let's just have a quick look at the other end of the world. And this table, I won't go through it in as much detail because the data is much, much less reliable for these countries. But these are the poorest countries in the world. These are all the countries that the UNDP describes as the least developed, the countries with the lowest life expectancy, the lowest staying on rates at school, the lowest GDP per capita. And in these countries, in most cases, you're looking at very sharp falls in the inequality ratio, although that may be affected by the fact that in the poorest fifth in these countries, people were living on subsistence incomes in the past and often had hardly any income because they were growing the food that they ate. So part of these falls may actually be a cash economy coming in. I'll zoom off that now, because what I want to talk about now for the rest of the talk, just for about 5 or 10 minutes, is the best of 1%. Now in 2012 I published a book called The No-Nonsense Guide to Equality, and in that book I produced a series of graphs based on the world top incomes data set. And very recently I've updated those graphs. This is what the overall graph looked like, published around about 4 years ago. I picked 12 countries. I think they were almost the only 12 countries where you could get good data at the time. And in all those countries, around about 100 years ago, the world was very unequal. Within the countries, the 1% were taking between 20% of all income, that's an enormous amount, and at best 12% of all income. And then in all those countries, inequality fell and the 1% took less. It began variously around the time of the First World War or the Second World War in some cases, and in almost every case, countries became more equal, the 1% took less and less until the late 1970s, and then you see inequalities tending to rise in most, but to very different levels. And here's the graph updated. Now you may think I'm getting too excited about this, but if you look at the last few years, it's really 5 or 6 years of additional data we now have, and you look at the very end, you can begin to see what appear to be falls. And the question is whether what we're beginning to see is a tipping point or an aberration or a temporary effect of the economic crisis of 2008. Here I've highlighted the years for particular countries. So the 1% took their highest according to the World Income Database in 2012 in the United States, less in 2013, it rose again in 2014, but not back to that 2012 maximum. The UK is the data I'm most suspicious of, and the problem is I know the UK well. In the UK, apparently the 1% took the most ever in 2009, and it's fallen since then. But we know that the top 1% have also been hiding their money in the United Kingdom far more since 2009, creating companies which aren't really companies, but ways in which they can avoid paying tax and avoid declaring income. And this is my worry. Is what I am seeing worldwide actually the best of 1% hiding money more? Or are we really seeing falls and it's just in Britain that's occurring? Canada, maximum inequality in 2009. Germany 2008. We don't have up-to-date data for India. Switzerland 2008, more equal since then. France 2011. We've only got 1 year that's less than equal, but if you're an optimist like me, that's good news. Japan, maybe it was before 2008 by this measure. So although Japan has become much more unequal when we look at the ratio of the best of fifth to the worst of fifth, when we look at the top 1% in Japan, they are still taking less. The Netherlands, 2008, or a small peak in 2010. Finland, not quite sure yet. Sweden is still rising. But China, and China matters because it's so big, China peaked in 2008 and appears to be falling afterwards. Now, I may be clutching at straws, but I think people should look at these things. I'll just show you a few of these countries individually, and then I'll end with a conclusion. So we've had falls in the United States, in the UK, but I think it's an artifact, and it's massive. It's this very big fall here. In Canada, in Switzerland, in France, in Japan, in the Netherlands, in Finland, and in China, and we don't have data for India. Here are the curves for the United States and Canada. They're very similar. Very unequal in the past, and then the U-shaped curve. The big increase in equality occurred after the Second World War in these countries, and then a rise much bigger in the USA than in Canada, and then look, a fall in Canada and a tentative fall in the USA. Barack Obama has raised some taxes, but I'll show you something very interesting about the USA at the very end. Here's the UK and France, and this is just to show just how different countries can be. And again, we're looking at a period from around about 1910 to around about 2010. Both countries became more equal, and then in the 1970s they diverged. France held on to its equality, the UK became much more unequal, and then this big fall in the declared income and taxation of the 1%. Here's Switzerland and the Netherlands. Now these are two countries that actually managed to control their 1%. And so the 1% never took much more than 10% or much more than 6%, 6.7% of income in the Netherlands. And the Netherlands is becoming more equal, and Switzerland is becoming more equal. And Switzerland has a financial sector, but Swiss bankers are paid roughly half what bankers are paid in the United Kingdom. Here's Finland and Sweden, two very equal countries, but ones that have recently worried about growing inequality. But it appears not to be a great problem in Finland. There's a downward curve in recent years. In Sweden, there's a slight, ever so slight upward trend, but very, very equal. The 1% only taking 6%, 7% of all income. That means average incomes of people in the 1% just being 6 times more than the actual arithmetic average for the country. We had that in the United Kingdom when I was a child. Last time we had that in the 1970s. Here's India and China. Very unequal, become very equal, and then follow the world trend again for the 1970s to growing inequality until recently in China, inequality appears to have fallen, if you can believe this data. And this is the only data we have. And two more countries in the series just to show how different things can be. Germany and Japan were just as unequal as the rest of the rich countries of the world before the Second World War. There is nothing to make you more equal than losing a war. The Japanese pattern has been of incredible equality and economic success and health success and educational success, and there's the rise in inequality that people worry about in Japan. But it's very, very small compared to what other countries have experienced. And here's the rise in inequality in Germany, but a fall in what the 1% has taken recently in Germany, and a fall recently in Japan. Not many more slides to go now. I won't try and explain this slide. This is all the countries that I didn't include in 2012 because we didn't have data in 2012. And these countries, Argentina, Australia, Denmark, Indonesia, Ireland, Italy, Korea, Malaysia, New Zealand, Norway, Portugal, Singapore, South Africa, Spain, Uruguay, and Zambia. We now have data on the 1%. And again, if you look at the very end, we can begin to see a fall. So here's the table. Australia may have peaked in 2007. Argentina doesn't have up-to-date data. Denmark isn't showing a slowdown yet, but is pretty equitable. Indonesia, we don't have the data. Ireland peaked in 2006 and is falling really since then. Italy peaked in 2007. Korea appeared, if it has peaked more recently. Malaysia in 2010. New Zealand has not yet peaked. Norway in 2007. Singapore way back in 2008. And Singapore introduced capital controls to stop people with money buying property in Singapore after the crash in 2008, and to stop Singapore becoming more unequal because it was so unequal. South Africa, 2007, Spain, 2006, Uruguay, 2010. Something appears to be happening. The classic thing at this point is to say it's too early to say, and it obviously is very, very early days, but I think it would be sad if there is so much interest in inequality worldwide, and if we're getting data we've never had before, and we don't notice that something is happening. The leader of China in the 1970s once said, and it was misreported that he was talking about the French Revolution, he was actually talking about the 1968 uprising, in France, he once said it's too early to say. But it's certainly too early to say in 2016 whether the financial crash represents a tipping point of the same magnitude as the tipping point of the First World War and the Russian Revolution. What we can know from looking back at that period is that it didn't appear to be a tipping point. The world began to become rapidly more equal in the 1920s and 30s. Most of the equality gained was gained before 1939 and before the Second World War. But it didn't feel like it was becoming more equal in the 1920s and 30s. It doesn't feel that it's getting better when it is very bad. And here's my very last point, and I find this fascinating. On May 17th, less than a month ago, Reuters had a headline which was broadcast around the world. It was in the Guardian newspaper in Britain. And the headline, which the journalist faithfully repeated, was that the CEO worker pay gap has stayed wide despite wage hikes in the United States. The Guardian newspaper said gap still too high. But here's the statistics. The chief executive officers of the Savings and Poor 500 companies, the richest companies in the United States, on average in 2015 had incomes of 335 times more than their rank and file workers. 335. So that may appear to be enormous to you. But a year earlier, in 2014, their incomes had been 373 times higher. In just 1 year, that ratio had fallen from 373 to 1 to 335 to 1. And I think this is a brilliant example of innumeracy in the United States and United Kingdom. We do not recognise that that is an incredible event. What happened is the average pay of US CEOs fell from $13.5 million a year in 2014 to $12.4 million. That's more than $1 million fall on average in 2015. And at the same time, the average pay of workers rose by just $900 a year. But there are millions of workers. So if you're going to increase the average pay of workers by $900 a year, you have to decrease the pay of CEOs by $1 million a year, unless you can make money out of nothing. And this is the fastest change I have seen in my lifetime towards greater equality. Now, in 1980, the average CEO of the top 500 firms then, which were a different set of 500 firms in many cases, made only 42 times more. By 1990, that ratio had risen to 107 times. So the reason that people say that this isn't something to celebrate is because it was so different in the past, in my lifetime. But we should at least recognise that for the first time since any of us were alive, this ratio has fallen, and it may continue to fall. It's shareholder pressure, but it's not just shareholder pressure. It's a change in the moral sentiment worldwide. When you have the president of China, when you have Barack Obama saying that inequality is the biggest problem in the world apart from climate change, when the Pope tells you this is a problem, when the economic leaders who meet at Davos every year put economic inequality amongst their top 3 of the 31 greatest global challenges, eventually it begins to have an effect. And that may be beginning now. But what do we get? Who doesn't want you to think about this? Who wants you not to see it as a problem, or even see it as something that's bad? James Copeland, as reported by Reuters, senior fellow at the free market think tank, the Manhattan Institute, called the study useless because it compares 2 different labour markets. Markets that should be evaluated separately because a new thinking has arisen, which is we're not really one species. We're not the same kind of people. There are different people. There are people who are worth millions of dollars a year, and people where it's a waste to give them $900 more a year. Because apparently the CEOs can't be substituted because somehow somebody's packed some enormous brain in their skull, and they're not like the people who work in their factories. And that's what you're up against. If you want to reduce inequality, there are a group of people who believe that there are different human beings, so different that they are not comparable. And it's getting away from that thinking, back to the thinking that we had in the 1960s and 70s, that all human beings are the same, that we don't have such huge differences between us, that some of us are worth millions of times more than others. That's what the fight is. From 2017 onwards, the US Securities and Exchange Commission is going to require all public companies to disclose the pay ratios of their CEOs to the median compensation of their employees. In Britain, public bodies are already reporting the ratio of the top paid person to the median middle person. We could be on the beginnings of a slope of seeing inequality fall year after year after year for the rest of the rest of your lives. There's absolutely no guarantee of this, but if it's beginning to happen, we ought to say it appears to be beginning to happen, because then if it doesn't happen, the anger will be even greater. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for this very interesting presentation, Professor Dorling. So I would like to ask the members of the group if they have any questions to ask. If you prefer writing your questions in the chat box, then that's also possible. Okay. Let me see. So you got some reactions, Professor Dorling. Thanks a lot. Very inspiring and insightful. Another question. Yeah. Can changes in inequality in such a short period after the crisis represent a trend that countries have passed their peak inequality? Maybe the rich population suffered income loss or income growth during after the crisis, which led to a fall in inequality. Once the crisis has passed and with the neoliberal system, inequality will rise.
Yeah, it's a very good question. When the crisis first hit in 2008 and 2009, there was an assumption that this will be the beginning of the declining inequality, because we've never seen inequality as high, at least since the 1920s, as it is now. But then what happened is that there was a housing market crash in the United States, and a little crash in well, much of Europe, actually quite a big crash. And people with quite a lot of money moved in and they bought cheap housing of poor people who tried to buy it. And then they became landlords and they made themselves richer by being landlords. And there were many other things that the wealthy did. So the richest 1,000 people in the United Kingdom, whose wealth is reported in the Sunday Times, have doubled their wealth since 2009 because they could make clever investments in a crisis. However, what these new figures are suggesting is those richest 1,000 people are unusual. And the billionaires in the world are unusual. When you go beneath the kind of people that Oxfam worry about when they say that you can fit a group of billionaires in a bus and they own more wealth than the poorest half of humanity, when you go below that group to the everyday 1%, which means people earning more than $300,000 a year in the US and people earning over £200,000 in the UK, you're not seeing them getting richer very recently. The question is whether they will be able to recruit that position. For instance, you're seeing people who, such as the person who runs the BBC, having the salary halved because it's seen as wrong in Britain that the person who runs the BBC should be paid as much. You're seeing the top paid presenters being paid much less than they used to be paid. You're seeing Barclays Bank sending Bob Diamond back to the United States with his tail between his legs because his salary was seen as disgusting. The moral tone has changed. People are no longer impressed by people taking a large amount of money, and this is even in the United Kingdom. Martin Sorrell, the boss of WPP, is currently trying to take £70 million this year in income, more than any other CEO in the whole country. And on national BBC Public Radio this morning, there was a debate about whether he should be taking half that or a quarter of that. These kind of debates didn't happen 5, 6 or 7 years ago. Now, there will always be greedy people who want to take as much as they possibly can. The question is whether the rest of society, which is the vast majority of people, including the vast majority of the elite, will remain so incensed about what has happened that they do discuss rich people's income publicly and talk about it as embarrassing. Our current Conservative government in the United Kingdom is pushing ahead with publishing these inequality ratios in the public service. The first part of the public service that has recorded 2 ratios is Her Majesty's Treasury, the tax collecting body. And in HM Treasury, the ratio between the CEO of the Treasury and the average worker has fallen. So if you've got a pretty right-wing Conservative government in the UK actually trying to reduce pay inequality, admittedly in the public sector, it gives you a sense that something has moved. You also have examples, sorry, I'll end the question shortly. Robert H. Frank has just written a brilliant book called Success and Chance. Now, Robert H. Frank is, I think, possibly the most successful popular economist in the world. He wrote one of the main economics textbooks with Ben Bernanke. He is hardly a radical economist. He's now in his 70s, though, and there's an advantage of getting old. Robert Frank in Success and Chance talks about how it would be to the benefit of extremely rich people like him, because his textbook sold very well, to be taxed at a higher marginal rate and to have less income for their own good. And when you get mainstream economists writing very cleverly worded books saying that we should be becoming more equal, it's different to what he was writing 10 or 20 years ago. Subtly different, but it is different. I have a feeling things are on the move. I worry that we'll get a sense of despair and people will carry on saying it's awful, the gap is too big, and the only thing you can try and do is get into the 1%. And we'll have mass innumeracy, that people won't realise that only a tiny proportion of them can get into the 1%. But that's just my worry. I also have an enormous faith in the ability of people to work out just how much money you waste if you give so much to such a tiny proportion of people, and what they then do with the money, which is so incredibly inefficient. I suspect that we are at a turning point. I just have no idea whether we will keep turning for about 20 years and it be really painful, or whether we'll do what happened before, which is actually quite a rapid reduction in the income and then the wealth of the best of, and the beginnings of actual rises in the material well-being of most people. You have to remember, for the average American, there has been no increase in living standards for 30 years. For the average person in Britain, there has been no increase in living standards now for over 10 years. How long are people going to accept the idea of no improvement in the quality of their life, while a small proportion of people in their society are able to fly around the world in jets wherever they want to go? Thank you.
Thank you for that answer. I see Sarah, you have a question. Do you want to ask if I microphone or? Okay. Sarah?
Oh yeah, I added it to the chat, but I can just say it here. I have a question just going back to slides 5 and 6. I know you said you don't really like to use the Gini coefficient, but I was wondering if any of the trends you observe in any of those countries change drastically when you compare Gini's versus doing the quintile comparison.
It's a very good question. And I have to be honest, I like Gini so much I haven't even looked. And I should tell you why I dislike the Gini and the Thiel and even the Atkinson index. There's 2 reasons. One is inequality is such a complicated concept anyway, that just looking at ratios and the change in ratios is hard enough for most people. The second problem, though, is that these indexes average out inequality in a very strange way. So the Gini index is hardly altered at all when the 1% take more or less, because the 1% is just 1% of your population. Now the problem is that the behaviour of the 1% has a huge impact on a society. It's not just that in the US they're taking 20% of all income, which essentially makes the United States like a country with 80% of its GDP, as far as most people are concerned. It changes the ethos of a country if the 1% take more, and the Gini doesn't pick it up. Owen Jones famously said that there are more people in the Canary Wharf Tower in London, in Barclays Bank, earning over £1 million a year than in the whole of Japan. So if you have an entire society of over 130 million people, I think now, where the idea of somebody getting £1 million a year is just seen as wrong, it changes Japanese society. So people in Japan look at each other and see themselves as the same now. They didn't in the 1920s. In the opposite way to that man in the United States can talk about this is two separate markets as if these are two separate species. And that's the problem with the Gini. The Gini doesn't capture the real danger of inequality. One sad thing about inequality is there doesn't seem to be much impact of what happens to the bottom 1% of your society. So in Japan, the bottom 1% are very badly off. They're often living in tents, in blue tents, and they're homeless. But overall, this doesn't affect Japanese statistics on life expectancy and health and education. You can treat the bottom 1% pretty badly, and the rest of your society can get on well. What you cannot do is allow the richest people to take so much and expect society to work. And part of the reason is not just because of what they take, but the people just beneath them try and take something that's only half as much, but that's still an enormous amount of money. And then the people just beneath them, which is people like me, a professor in the University of Oxford, I demand a very high salary because I just want to be able to buy a normal-sized house. And a normal-sized house in the United Kingdom in Oxford costs a fortune, whereas a normal-sized house in a more equal country costs a normal amount of money. So things go very, very badly wrong, and it isn't picked up by the Gini coefficient. And I don't see the value in it. There are complicated summary measures which do have a value. The most famous is life expectancy. This is actually a very complicated statistic, and isn't what you might think it is, but it is still very valuable. I've yet to see somebody demonstrate why the Gini index is actually a valuable measure.
I just had a question that follows up on this question about the Palmer index.
Oh, I like the Palmer index. This is the ratio of the if I get it right. Is it the bottom 40% to the top 10%?
I think it's the 80 to 20.
Might be 80-20. No, I think Palmer is something like, I think it's the bottom 40% to top 10 because it generally tends to move around one. Generally, the top 10% have 4 times as much as the bottom 40%. The Palmer index is a much similar index anyway. It's simpler. It's a ratio, and so I don't mind it as much. But it's not as simple as the ratio that I've shown you of the top 20 to the bottom 20, or even better, the top 10 to the bottom 10, which we don't get from UNDP anymore. These are really easy. So in this country, in the UK, I'm in the top 10%. The top 10% are getting over 10 times more than the bottom 10%, which means that I will be able to buy food, 10 times as much food as somebody in the bottom 10%, which makes it easier for me to get fat. I can have holidays that people can't imagine in the bottom 10%. I can buy a house where they can only rent in a very poor area. And it's 10 times is very simple to understand. You can do better than this even. I mean, this is for people who can cope with numbers and ratios of money. The much more dramatic figure to give you for the UK is that people in the top 10% may have 3, 4, 5 or 6 holidays a year, going away from their home and not staying with family and friends. And this is children in the top 10%. The bottom half of children in the United Kingdom, almost all of the bottom half of children, do not get a single holiday a year. They may lie about the holiday when they come back to the school holidays, but their parents cannot afford to take them away to the cheapest caravan holiday in the country. And we used to have holidays for almost everybody, but we no longer do that. And this is my difficulty of trying to explain things. I don't like the Gini because it doesn't even work for many people who are pretty numerate. I like the income ratios, but for most people who don't like numbers that much, you have to start talking about what presents you get, or if you get any presents for a birthday, whether you're ashamed about the clothes that you're wearing, whether you can actually afford to buy underwear, so that as a child, when you're changing for physical education at school, do people notice you haven't got any underwear because your parents couldn't actually afford to buy it for you? And those much more emotive statistics are more effective for most people than these inequalities.
I have 3 more questions, but I think we might have time for 1 more question.
Okay.
So maybe I ask a question related to the UK case.
Yes.
So a member is asking, if the UK leaves the EU, do you think this will hurt the prospects of reducing inequality in the UK?
Oh, okay. we have a referendum in a few days on the 23rd of June about leaving the EU. So you're wanting a prediction of what might happen. I think we're likely to remain. But if we were to vote to leave, we'll be asked to have another referendum. And then supposing we misbehave and we were to leave in that referendum, I want us to remain. I'm voting to remain, and I've said I think people should vote to remain. However, my prediction, if we were to leave, is that inequality would fall. And it would fall because the economic crash would be so great in the United Kingdom, and the crash in the value of housing would be so great that the rich would actually become much poorer, and the poor can't become any poorer than they already are. That the economic catastrophe that would happen would actually result in a much more equal country, not dissimilar to what happens when you lose a war. However, I'm not very confident about my own predictions, and also living through that is going to be extremely uncomfortable. So I wish we could become more equitable without becoming more equitable due to economic disaster. But we are quite capable of voting our way into an economic disaster. And if we do, we'll become much poorer quickly. We will lose young people who come in. We have a huge influx of young people who keep this country working for the rest of Europe. And our pensioners who we send to Spain and other countries to save us money for their retirement, they'll start coming back. And so we'll have to look after our old, and we won't have the young who we haven't paid for their education. And we'll be in bad trouble for about 2 decades. And then we can go begging back to Europe to see if they'll take us back. And we'll be a much poorer and a much more equitable country, perhaps without a Conservative Party. There's a prediction for you. But I do think we will vote to remain, because I think the British public are aware that the politicians who are asking them to leave are a very strange set of the Conservative Party. And it has to be said on this, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the chief priest of the established Church of Britain, labelled the man who wants us to leave the most a racist yesterday on national television. And that tells you that things are getting fairly heated over here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your talk and for answering questions, and also thank you very much to the audience for answering all the questions. So I just want to close this webinar by some comments. So first of all, some of the work that Professor Dorling discussed is based on 2 of his books, which is first is called Inequality and the 1%, and the second one is a newer book which is called The Better Politics. The book that you see right now on the screen, this one is already uploaded on the Basecamp website, so I will make sure to upload the other 2 books as well soon. Then I would like to follow up by introducing our next webinar. So this one will be held on the 13th of July. We touched a little bit upon the topic, Professor Dorling touched a little bit on the topic of hidden money. So we will discuss next time the book The Hidden Wealth of Nations by Professor Zuckman. I will be leading this discussion, and together with one of our members, Atanas, who will be discussing it during the seminar. So thank you very much for attending, and we look forward to welcoming you next time during our next webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.